Somewhere in the middle of one of the most unforgiving deserts on Earth sits a place that, for years, even the Prime Minister of Australia was not fully briefed on. A place where 6 unarmed peace activists, carrying nothing more dangerous than a Tibetan singing bowl and a red cockatoo feather, were prosecuted under a Cold War law originally written to jail spies, facing up to 7 years in prison for the crime of walking onto a hillside and singing a lament. A place so secretive that for more than 2 decades the Australian government refused to publicly confirm what actually happened inside it, even as it quietly grew, dome by dome, into one of the most important intelligence installations on the planet. And according to sworn courtroom testimony, leaked intelligence documents, and multiple independent investigations, this remote patch of red desert now plays a role in deciding who lives and who dies on the other side of the world through military operations carried out thousands of kilometres away, in conflicts most Australians never voted for. Historians, journalists, and even Australia's own courts have spent over 50 years trying to fully understand what happens here. Even now, most of it remains classified. This is Pine Gap. And the real reason the United States built a secret base in the heart of the Australian Outback is stranger and far more consequential than any alien conspiracy theory ever told about it. If you're new here, welcome. This channel is dedicated to the geography, science, and buried history of the world's most mysterious places, from ancient shipwrecks to craters that shouldn't exist. If you want more deep dives into the strangest, most secretive corners of the planet, subscribe and turn on notifications, because we post new investigations regularly. Now, let's go back to the beginning to a quiet valley in the central Australian desert that the outside world was never meant to know about. To understand why this exact location was chosen, you first have to understand the land itself. Pine Gap sits roughly 19 kilometres southwest of the town of Alice Springs, in Australia's Northern Territory, almost precisely at the geographic centre of the continent. This is not a coastal outpost or a convenient stretch of open plain. It is deep interior desert, thousands of kilometres from open ocean in every direction, ringed by some of the oldest mountains on Earth. The facility takes its name from the terrain around it. In this part of Australia, a gap is a specific geological feature, a narrow break or pass, where a creek has, over almost incomprehensible spans of time, cut directly through a mountain range. Pine Gap sits in a shallow valley within the McDonnell Ranges, a chain of jagged, blood-red quartzite ridges that once stood as tall as the modern Himalayas, roughly 300 to 450 million years ago. What remains today are their eroded, folded roots, layer upon layer of ancient seabed, buckled upward by immense tectonic pressure, then worn down over hundreds of millions of years by wind, flash flooding, and relentless sun. Geologists consider the McDonnell Ranges among the oldest continuously exposed mountain systems on the planet, a landscape so ancient that describing it on human timescales barely makes sense. The climate matches the geology in its extremity. Summer daytime temperatures regularly climb past 40 degrees Celsius, radiating off red earth and spinifex grass in shimmering waves, while winter nights can fall below freezing. Rain is rare and unpredictable. When it finally comes, dry creek beds can turn into raging torrents within hours, then vanish again within days. It is a landscape of scorching stillness, interrupted by sudden, violent change beautiful, and thoroughly unforgiving toward anyone unprepared for it. It was into this landscape, in the mid-1960s, that American and Australian officials came looking for a very specific kind of ground, somewhere remote enough to guarantee secrecy, geologically stable enough to support delicate tracking equipment, dry and electromagnetically quiet enough that radio interference from nearby cities would not corrupt sensitive satellite signals, and positioned precisely enough to maintain a direct, uninterrupted line of sight to geostationary satellites hanging above the Indian Ocean and beyond. Central Australia was, in almost every respect, close to perfect. What eventually rose from that red dirt, beginning in 1966, would become one of the strangest skylines in the world. Dozens of massive white geodesic domes, nicknamed golf balls by locals, scattered across a fenced compound roughly the size of a small town, connected by internal roads, guarded around the clock, and sitting beneath permanently restricted airspace. Alongside the domes stand dozens of uncovered antennas, solar arrays, and hardened operations buildings. Close to 800 personnel, roughly split between Australian and American staff, work inside a compound with no public road access and no public tours. From the air, it looks almost otherworldly, a gleaming, high-technology settlement dropped without warning into the middle of one of the oldest, driest, most geologically ancient landscapes on the continent. But the true purpose of those domes, and why this exact valley was chosen out of an entire continent to hold them, goes back to a much older story, one that belongs to the people who called this land home for tens of thousands of years before anyone had ever spoken the words satellite or signals intelligence. Long before Pine Gap existed, long before Australia existed as a nation at all, this land was, and remains, Arrernte country. The Arrernte people, specifically the central and eastern Arrernte, have lived in and cared for this stretch of desert for at least 30,000 years, making it one of the longest continuously inhabited landscapes on Earth. To them, Alice Springs is not Alice Springs at all it is Mapantwi, and it sits at the heart of one of the most densely sacred landscapes in the country, with more than 600 registered sacred sites recorded within the town's boundaries alone. The McDonnell Ranges that cradle Pine Gap are not, in Arrernte tradition, a geological accident. According to the Caterpillar Dreaming, one of the oldest and most significant creation stories of the Mpantwe region, still told, still painted, and still central to how many Arrernte people understand their own identity, the ranges themselves were shaped by ancestral caterpillar beings, among them Yeparenye, Intialka, and Utnarengate. According to the story, these giant caterpillars converged on this country from the 4 points of the compass before being attacked by their enemy, a giant stink bug. Where they fell, their bodies became the ridgelines of the east and west McDonnell Ranges. Where their heads were severed, the story holds, the mountains were split apart, forming the very gaps that cut through the range to this day, just as Pine Gap's namesake does. This is a living creation story, not a relic one that continues to shape how the Arrernte relate to this exact country. What the ancients understood, long before any government arrived with fences and radomes, was something more immediate than any single story, that this land could kill you if you did not respect it. For tens of thousands of years, Arrernte knowledge, carried through songlines passed down across countless generations, recorded the precise locations of permanent water, the seasonal dangers of heat and flash flood, and the safest paths across a desert that offered no forgiveness for carelessness. This was not superstition, it was survival knowledge, refined over hundreds of generations, encoded not in textbooks, but in story, song, and ceremony. European explorers who arrived in the 1800s learned this the hard way. When the Scottish-born explorer John McDougall Stuart pushed north through this exact region in 1860, attempting to become the first European to cross the continent's dead centre, the desert very nearly finished him before he began. By the time his party reached the Finke River less than 100 kilometres from where Pine Gap sits today, his men were suffering from scurvy. And Stuart himself had already lost the sight of one eye. He would make 2 more attempts before finally succeeding in 1862, but by then he had to be carried out on a stretcher, his health permanently broken. He died just 4 years later, worn down, historians agree, by the sheer physical toll of trying to conquer this land. So when American and Australian officials went looking for the most remote, hidden, radio-silent stretch of desert they could find, they did not stumble onto empty, meaningless ground. They walked into one of the oldest continuously sacred landscapes in human history, a place whose original custodians had spent 30,000 years learning to survive its dangers, and whose isolation, harshness, and silence were exactly the qualities that would later make it ideal for hiding one of the most secretive facilities on the planet. To understand how strange the story of Pine Gap really is, you have to look at what has actually happened here. Not rumour, not speculation, but documented history. On the 9th of December, 1966, Prime Minister Harold Holt's government signed a treaty with the United States to build what was, on paper, a joint defence space research facility. That vague, deliberately bland name was the first of several official cover stories the base would carry over the decades. Construction began almost immediately, mired in controversy over land dealings from the outset. When the facility became operational in 1970, with the launch of its first satellite, codenamed Rhyolite, most members of the Australian Parliament and the Australian public had no real idea what it was actually for. For years, successive governments simply declined to explain. 9 years after that treaty was signed, Pine Gap found itself at the centre of the single most controversial event in modern Australian political history. Prime Minister Gough Whitlam had grown increasingly uneasy about the scale of unchecked American intelligence activity on Australian soil, and reportedly began pushing to review the secretive arrangements around facilities like Pine Gap. On the 11th of November 1975, in an unprecedented constitutional crisis, Whitlam was dismissed from office by the Governor-General. Historians remain divided over exactly why, but the timing fueled one of Australia's most persistent political theories, that concerns in Washington over Whitlam's stance on Pine Gap played some role behind the scenes. It has never been proven. It has also never fully gone away. That same period produced an even stranger footnote. A young American named Christopher Boyce had taken a job at True W, the aerospace contractor that built and operated the very satellites Pine Gap depended on. Working inside a restricted communications vault nicknamed the Black Vault, Boyce began reading classified CIA cable traffic, including messages he later said revealed Washington's discomfort with Whitlam's stance on Pine Gap. Disillusioned, Boyce recruited a childhood friend, small-time drug dealer Andrew Dalton Lee, to smuggle satellite secrets to Soviet agents in Mexico City. The two were finally caught in January 1977. Boyce was sentenced to 40 years, escaped from a federal prison in 1980, hiding for hours in a drainage hole before cutting through the perimeter fence with a pair of tin snips, evaded capture for well over a year, and was eventually recaptured and handed decades more time. He would not walk free again for more than 2 decades. His story became a best-selling book and an Oscar-nominated film, The Falcon and the Snowman. As Cold War nuclear anxiety peaked in the early 1980s, Pine Gap became a lightning rod for public protest. In November 1983, the Women for Survival movement organised a mass demonstration outside the base's gates, part of a wave of Palm Sunday peace marches drawing hundreds of thousands of participants across the country each year. By 1985, members of the Alice Springs Peace Group were still taking direct action, on one occasion using bicycles to physically block traffic heading toward the facility. None of it stopped construction. The base kept growing. In 2005, 4 Christian pacifists, later known as the Pine Gap Four, cut through an inner perimeter fence. 2 of them photographed themselves on the roof of a building inside the compound before being arrested. Their actions shut the base down for 6 hours. They became the first people in Australian history charged under the obscure Defence Act of 1952, a Cold War-era law, carrying a maximum sentence of 7 years, that had never before been tested in open court. Convicted in 2007, their case was ultimately overturned on appeal in 2008. after judges ruled the trial had denied them a fair defence. 11 years later, in September 2016, 6 more activists who called themselves the Pine Gap Pilgrims scaled the perimeter fence and walked deep into the compound. One of them, 44-year-old Paul Christie, was found several kilometres inside the base, kneeling in a dry creek bed, praying. All 6 were charged under that same 1952 law and faced up to 7 years in prison. At their trial, an expert witness gave evidence that would change the entire tone of the case. Sworn testimony that Pine Gap supplies geolocation data used in American drone strikes overseas. The jury found all 6 guilty. The judge, reportedly wary of turning them into martyrs, declined to send any of them to prison, issuing fines instead. If you're waiting for this story to take a supernatural turn for us to tell you about aliens, or hidden underground bases, or unexplained lights in the desert sky, keep watching. Because what investigators actually found hiding behind Pine Gap secrecy is stranger and far more consequential than any conspiracy theory. Make sure you're subscribed, because we're about to show you exactly what that courtroom testimony really meant, and just how far this remote desert base actually reaches. For decades, the sheer secrecy surrounding Pine Gap did exactly what secrecy always does. It filled the silence with rumour, long before anyone outside government had reliable information about what happened inside those domes. Pine Gap had already earned a nickname that stuck, Australia's Area 51. The theories multiplied for a simple reason. When official secrecy meets an isolated, unexplainable, heavily restricted piece of land in the middle of the desert, speculation rushes in to fill the vacuum. Some claimed the domes concealed reverse-engineered alien technology. Others pointed to the base's proximity to Wycliffe Well, a roadside stop roughly 4 hours north that has, since the Second World War, built a reputation as the UFO capital of Australia, with decades of reported sightings and even a ranking among the world's top spots for UFO activity. Ufologists have long drawn a direct line between the two, arguing that the area's supposed paranormal energy is somehow connected to Pine Gap's presence. Others speculated about secret weather control experiments, hidden underground tunnels, or unexplained electromagnetic effects on wildlife and human health. None of it, examined closely, has ever held up. What did hold up? What took decades of painstaking, unglamorous work to uncover was something almost more remarkable: the actual truth. Beginning in the 1980s, an Australian National University researcher named Desmond Ball spent years filing Freedom of Information requests, cross-referencing satellite photographs, interviewing former personnel, and meticulously cataloguing every antenna and structure on the site. His research, published against significant official resistance, became the first serious public account of what Pine Gap actually did, and it directly contradicted the government's decades-old cover stories. Years later, journalists working from documents leaked in 2013 by former NSA analyst Edward Snowden confirmed and expanded on Ball's findings, revealing that the facility was internally codenamed Rainfall and that its official public justification, something about verifying arms control agreements and monitoring military developments, was at best a heavily simplified version of the truth. As for the domes themselves, their real purpose turns out to be almost disappointingly mundane, and yet strategically brilliant. Radomes are simply weatherproof shells, usually fiberglass or coated fabric, that protect delicate satellite dishes from dust storms, extreme heat, and wind, while remaining transparent to the radio signals passing through them. But at a facility like Pine Gap, they serve a second, more calculated purpose. Because the domes are opaque to the human eye, no observer, not a curious hiker on a nearby ridge, and not a foreign reconnaissance satellite passing overhead, can determine which direction any individual antenna is pointed, or which satellite it happens to be tracking at any given moment. It is not alien concealment. It is a physical form of encryption, dozens of identical white spheres, deliberately designed so that from the outside, Everything looks the same, and nothing gives away what or who is actually being watched. There are no aliens at Pine Gap. There is no credible evidence of an underground extraterrestrial laboratory, no verified electromagnetic health crisis, no confirmed connection to the lights reported at Wycliffe Well. What investigators did find, however, was arguably far stranger than fiction. Hard evidence that this fenced compound in the middle of the Australian desert sits at the centre of a global satellite intelligence and missile early warning network and, according to multiple independent investigations, plays a direct role in the targeting process behind lethal military operations carried out on the other side of the planet. So what is Pine Gap really, once you strip away the myth and the rumour? It is, by the assessment of intelligence historians on both sides of the Pacific, one of the most important overseas intelligence installations belonging to the United States anywhere on Earth, a facility so deeply woven into the Five Eyes intelligence sharing alliance between the US, UK, Australia, Canada, and New Zealand that some analysts consider it effectively irreplaceable. Its geostationary satellites can detect a ballistic missile launch or a nuclear detonation within seconds, almost anywhere on the planet. During the 1991 Gulf War, Pine Gap systems reportedly helped detect Iraqi Scud missile launches in something close to real time. Today it continues to monitor missile and weapons testing from a rotating cast of nations, feeding data into US early warning systems around the clock. But the detail that has generated the most sustained public alarm, the one that surfaced under oath in an Australian courtroom from an expert witness testifying at the 2017 trial of the Pine Gap Pilgrims, is this, according to that testimony. And separately corroborated by leaked intelligence documents and multiple journalistic investigations, Pine Gap supplies geolocation data that has, at times, reportedly been used to help identify targets for American drone strikes, including, according to these reports, in countries where neither Australia nor the United States has formally declared war. Human rights researchers have raised serious concerns about what this could mean for Australia's own legal exposure, questioning whether a nation that helps locate a target could share responsibility for the consequences of the strike that follows, including any unintended civilian deaths. Both the Australian and American governments have consistently declined to confirm the specifics of these operations, citing national security. That refusal to confirm or deny is itself protected by the same 1952 secrecy law that has for 2 decades been used to prosecute unarmed protesters for trespassing. This is the part of the story with no aliens in it at all, and it is, by a wide margin, the most unsettling. An unremarkable-looking cluster of white domes, sitting quietly in the desert, largely unseen and unheard by the Australian public it technically answers to, may be connected, through classified data links almost no one will ever see the inside of, to decisions that end human lives thousands of kilometres away. It operates behind a wall of legal secrecy, so complete that the only people ever formally punished in connection with it are the handful of pacifists who tried to walk inside and ask questions. And this is where the ancient and the modern quietly converge. The Arrernte people who understood this land as dangerous were not describing curses or monsters. They were describing a landscape that punishes carelessness, that hides its dangers in plain sight, and that demands total respect from anyone who enters it, unprepared, a landscape whose vast silent isolation had to be learned and survived over tens of thousands of years. Those same qualities, isolation, silence, distance from prying eyes, are precisely what a government would look for if it wanted to build something meant to operate unseen and unaccountable. The land did not become dangerous because Pine Gap was built here. Pine Gap was built here because the land already was. The old warning was never supernatural. It was, in the most literal sense, environmental, and in a very real modern form, it still holds true today. In the end, Pine Gap tells us something larger than its own story. Science can explain the mechanics, the geostationary orbits, the physics of a radome, the geology of a 300 million-year-old mountain range. But it takes history and the deep, careful knowledge of the people who understood this land first to explain why any of it actually matters. The most enduring warnings, it turns out, are rarely about ghosts or monsters. They are about power, secrecy, and how easily the biggest truths can be hidden inside the emptiest looking places on Earth. Pine Gap is still there today, its dome still standing quietly beneath the desert sun, its true operations still almost entirely classified more than 50 years after its first satellite signal came down from orbit. So we want to know what you think. Do you believe the Whitlam theory? Does the drone strike testimony change how you see this place? Let us know in the comments, and if you want more deep dives into the world's most secretive geography, subscribe and we'll see you in the next one.